So many months ago, me being the casual Marvel enjoyer I was, I began to get really excited for a particular Marvel TV show set to come out on Disney+. Granted, I was excited for all of them, but the one that piqued my interest the most was Loki. I did my research on the concept of the show and really liked it. A story following up on Loki's escape in Endgame about an intriguing organization in control of the entire MCU abducting him and setting him on a crazy adventure through time and space, filled with wacky shenanigans and hilarious banter between Tom Hiddleston and Owen Wilson. I mean, there was no way they could go wrong with that, right? Right?
Wrong.
I watched the show when it came out, and I did enjoy it quite a bit initially, but after a while I've thought about it some more and my opinion has changed significantly. In hindsight, do I actually feel satisfied with how the show turned out? Not really. It's weird, because this is definitely one of the most acclaimed MCU properties of recent times. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad people enjoyed it and had a good time, and I respect everyone's taste, but like, this is literally one of the highest rated MCU properties ever. I don't want to say it's undeserved, but well, in my opinion, yeah, it's undeserved. Feel free to disagree with me, but in terms of my enjoyment, I would only give Loki a 6 or a 7 out of 10 at the very best, and in terms of how good I think it is, I'd probably rank it even lower. I vastly prefer the other two Marvel Disney Plus shows so far, even though both have issues of their own. It sucks because there are plenty of aspects of Loki I really like, but the rest of it spoils it for me and prevents it from being the masterpiece I was hoping for. Before I actually get into my thoughts, I will again mention I respect everyone's opinions and viewpoints regardless of whether or not they align with my own. If you hold the show to a higher or lower esteem than me, that's perfectly fine. I only made this video to share my own stance and have no intention of devaluing that of others. Oh, also this video will obviously contain spoilers. Please either watch the show or research it before continuing unless you don't care. Thanks. So if you somehow don't know about Loki, the basic premise of the series goes as follows. After stealing the Tesseract during the events of Avengers Endgame, an alternate version of Loki is brought to the mysterious Time Variance Authority, a bureaucratic organization that exists outside of time and space and monitors the timeline. They give Loki a choice, face being erased from existence due to being a time variant, or help fix the timeline and stop a greater threat. Loki ends up trapped in his own crime thriller, traveling through time. I don't feel like detailing the entire plot for all 6 episodes and would rather get to my criticisms as fast as possible, so if you still need more context, again, either watch the show and come back, or research the show and come back. With that out of the way though, let's get into my thoughts on Loki. So first of all, do I like the show? Well, sort of, but not really. Like I said before, there are things I do like a lot about it, but those positives aren't enough to save Loki from all its faults in my eyes. But, since you're likely wondering what those faults are, I've split them into sections. Let me start off with the first one, here and now. The story and concept of Loki is really interesting on paper, but it's not nearly as interesting in execution because it simply doesn't have time to be fleshed out. The TVA and the timeline and all the other potentially intriguing subjects are far from being as developed as they could have been. The fact that there's only 6 episodes is a massive detriment to the show, and while Disney is probably to blame for that more than anyone else, it's still a problem nonetheless. Considering the minuscule time span across which things are established, it feels as if the show is moving way too quickly to allow viewers to actually grow to care about anything or be affected by suspense. We spend no more than 2 episodes with the TVA before the first plot twist of its soldiers being variants from the timeline is revealed, and it's not that much later that we learn the timekeepers they worship are just robots. When the TVA begins to fall apart starting at episode 4, how are we supposed to react to this deviation from the norm when we've barely even seen what the norm was? When not enough time is spent establishing the status quo of a story, it lessens the impact of everything else that happens later down the line. Granted, I know this isn't a universal issue for every single viewer. Obviously, plenty of people watched the show and didn't let this bother them, but that doesn't mean it's not an issue. It also doesn't help that pretty much the majority of episode 3 is filler and wastes valuable time that could have been spent on more important aspects of the show, rather than all this Lamentis stuff that drags on way too long and adds nothing to the plot. Seriously, this episode pretty much exists purely to give Loki and Sylvie time to interact. It doesn't even matter in the end, because at the beginning of the next episode, they immediately get brought back to the TVA by being in love. Yeah, really. That's not even mentioning the fact that we don't even get to see the TVA fix all the timeline problems Sylvie causes at the end of episode 2, since they're already solved in episode 4. Like, are you kidding me? They could have cut out a solid half of the Lamentis nonsense in episode 3 and devoted that runtime to showing what the TVA was doing. Could have had this whole montage of them fixing the timeline with opera music in the background, like that one scene in Artemis Fowl, but not terrible. I just feel like having a whole episode composed of almost entirely filler when there was already so little time to develop the plot was a pretty stupid decision, but oh well. Again, I know it's not the show's fault there are only 6 episodes. I know that this is probably something only the Disney and Marvel executives can decide, but I think it's pretty telling that they weren't willing to dedicate anywhere near the amount of time necessary to flesh out something as important to the MCU as the TVA, let alone the literal timeline of the MCU itself. The show definitely would have benefited from more episodes. As is though, it just feels awfully rushed, period. I have some very major gripes with how the characters in Loki are handled. First off, Loki himself. Even though the show is literally named after him, it barely feels like it's about him. Despite supposedly being the focal point of the series, he really just seems to serve the plot more or less. Don't get me wrong, on his own, he is an excellent character, and there's definitely tiny modicums of him being interesting in this series. They do develop him a little bit, and I like those moments. For example, when he watches his own death in Infinity War during episode 1. Or when he gets stuck in a time loop during episode 4, and we learn a bit about how his narcissism stems primarily from his feelings of loneliness. I just wish there was a lot more of that, because for the most part it just seems like Loki is acting in service of the plot, rather than the plot acting in service of him. I'm not really a fan of Sylvie in this show either, and again, it's not because she's an inherently bad character. Just like with Loki, my issues stem from how the plot handles her. Not only does she primarily serve the plot, and not vice versa, just like Loki, her ideals and actions are inconsistent across the 6 episodes. For instance, we learn partway through the show that her goal is to destroy the TVA, and free the soldiers and agents who are being manipulated by their upper leadership, since they themselves are variants and don't know it. But if that was the case, how come she kills TVA Minutemen earlier in the show and she still plays the role of the mysterious enemy, even though she knows full well that those Minutemen are variants and the same people she's trying to free? I mean, come on, did no one think about this for like 5 seconds? Seriously. Anyway, I get that this is totally subjective, but the whole relationship between Loki and Sylvie just rubbed off on me the wrong way too. It's not even because of how Loki technically falls for himself, or at least an alternate version of himself. It's more so that the relationship just feels extremely unnatural and goes by too quickly. Loki and Sylvie meet at the end of episode 2 and are pretty much already in love by the end of episode 3. That span of time from their perspective can't have been more than a day, which is ridiculous. Relationships do not develop anywhere near that quickly, and that's without taking into account that these 2 Loki variants would naturally distrust each other first due to previously being enemies, and also because they know each other to be manipulative and deceptive. I can't fathom how in any plane of existence these 2 would already have a bond this strong less than a day after meeting. In fact, from their perspective of time, there's no way they've known each other for more than a few days, even by the point of the season finale, which is when they kiss. It just makes the relationship seem completely unbelievable because there's never any time skips, and what little development they get is rushed to the point of being completely unrealistic. As far as the other characters go, I don't have any major gripes besides the fact that they're underdeveloped, and most of them aren't particularly interesting or enjoyable to watch, with the exception of Mobius thanks to Owen Wilson's charisma. Speaking of which, I do wish the show put more focus on the dynamic between Loki and Mobius, since their interactions are great and definitely one of my favorite aspects of the series, but oh well. To sum up my thoughts for this section, there's pretty much no spectacular character work to note across the show for the reasons I've already presented. Moving on. I know some people probably don't like hearing about this stuff or don't care whatsoever, and I get why that is. But there's so many plot holes and logical errors in Loki that ignoring them becomes nigh impossible when you're trying to analyze the show. That said, I don't really have the brain capacity to list those out, which is where my close friend Crackman comes in, since he agreed to help me out with this section. Major props to him. I'll link his channel in the description and in a pinned comment. Again, if you don't like listening to people talk about plot holes and poor writing, just skip to the next section. I'll include a timestamp in post-editing. Now, with that out of the way, whoever is still here, please turn your attention to Crackman, who has written and will be narrating the rest of this section.
Hello everyone, Crackman here. If you couldn't already guess before I go into my rant, Loki presents a ton of logical errors with the introduction of the TVA, their logic behind what is a variant, and what breaks the timeline. Its introduction also causes massive retcons to the MCU lore, as we know. Just a disclaimer, I will not be going into detail about every plot hole because if I did, Posey's video would be 4 hours long. So I'm going to shorten it up and talk mostly about the ones that damage the series the most. Before I begin, I would like to thank Posey for having me on. Now, without further delays, let me begin. So I'm going to start off by going over the TVA's bullcrap system on how they decide what is considered a variant or not, which completely breaks the entire MCU. So when Loki is going to court, he pleads guilty, saying that it was the Avengers' fault for the alternate timeline being created. Then we get the judge's response.
Oh, what they did was supposed to happen. You escaping was not.
This response causes so many problems to the MCU's world building and completely massacres the timeline of events. First off, you mean to tell me it was scripted for the Avengers to go back in time and steal the Infinity Stones? Them going back in time to steal the stones caused many changes in the timeline, so why didn't they get pruned? Another aspect of Endgame that was destroyed by this line is the fact that there were parts of the Endgame time heist that happened because Loki picked up the Tesseract. The entire reason for Tony and Steve going back to the 1970s and getting the Tesseract and the extra Pym particles is because of Loki stealing the Tesseract in the first place. So that means Tony and Steve essentially broke the timeline by going to get the extra Pym particles in the Tesseract, yet that was supposed to happen. I don't really understand how the writers are either so lazy or so out of touch as to what happened in the MCU recently. Also, Steve going back to be with Peggy causes major damage to the MCU timeline, which it shouldn't be hard to comprehend why, but I'll tell you anyways. Steve traveling back into 1940s means he has massive potential to cause some damage to the timeline by, let's say, interacting with people he isn't supposed to and stuff like that. But no, he was apparently supposed to do that. Good God. Another plot hole I noticed is that if everything is predetermined, how is it possible for someone to break off the timeline? An acquaintance of mine, Jeb, points this out perfectly. He said, "Imagine it like a bubble. Everything is meant to occur as it is. How is one able to break the bubble? Since if someone travels back in time to do X, by that logic, it is always predetermined for them. You can't have everything predetermined in an aspect of it that causes something that is not predetermined. You need the flow of time to be in flux rather than an already set path. If that's too complex, I'll sum it down. Basically, the variants shouldn't be able to break a predetermined timeline because they were basically programmed to do one thing, so it shouldn't be possible for another variable to fall out of place that would cause an alternate timeline to appear." My next point is, what classifies as a variant, since this show appears muddled on their definition. It states that anyone that steps out of their predetermined path is a variant. However, by that logic, in Endgame there are so many variants that are left alone due to the time travel heist. Cap in 2012, Nebula in 2013, even though she died, Thanos in 2014, even though he died, Thanos' army in 2014, once again, even though they all died, Gamora in 2014, just to name a few. So what about those? How do you deal with those variants that are causing changes in time? And no, I don't want to hear that it was predetermined for those variants to do what they did, because it shouldn't be predetermined for the Avengers to go back in time and alter the events of the MCU timeline. I'm left to wonder if the timeline just resets or removes them. Another thing, why isn't the Ancient One a variant? Because of her interaction with the 2023 Hulk, since that happens before Loki. She's not on her path. Where are they? After that, we get another destructive aspect. They can now easily collect Infinity Stones. Remember those stones that were created in Infinity War when the universe was containing what perceived to be an infinite amount of power? They're now paperweights. Yes, the introduction of the TVA means that the Infinity Stones are now paperweights. You can collect them at any time and collect multiple of them too. How is an organization that powerful existed all this time in the MCU without anyone knowing? This is just absurd, and it's something I will not suspend my disbelief for. Now, I'm going to jump into the last episode, because while the others are extremely flawed and have plot holes on their own, there's nothing major when it comes to damage in the greater MCU. Episode 2 does confirm an aspect of the part that I believe does a lot of damage, but that intertwines with something Posey will explain later in the video. I'm going to start off with the scene where Loki and Sylvie talk to Kang. This is the scene where they establish the gambit from killing Kang. It's either chaos that is cataclysmic, or you have order which is tyrannical. Why are these options? Literally, they establish that they can remove timelines earlier. Just remove all the timelines involving conquering Kangs. You don't need either extreme here. Those universes can continue the way they are. Just the ones with the evil Kangs can't exist. I know this is still morally dubious, however this character isn't focused on that. Just removing evil Kangs prevents this apparent multiversal war. Why do this? None of this functions, Kang. Overall, Loki's plot is dysfunctional and egregious, and these plot holes and retcons genuinely give me a mental breakdown. I hope no other media goes down the path Loki did in terms of logic and writing. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Once again, I would like to thank Posey for having me on. Now I've got to head out. I've got to hate on one of his movies that he liked recently.
So yeah, there you have it. Major thanks to Crackman for helping discuss these issues. I'm much more lenient than he is, but I still have to agree with everything he said. To summarize my thoughts and conclude this section, the writing in Loki is completely bonkers, and although that may be the issue that ticks me off the least of these four, it's still problematic nonetheless. I feel like this is the most annoying problem with Loki out of all of them, because not only is it an issue with the show itself, it also affects the entire cinematic universe. It's established many times that all the events of the timeline were pre-planned, which means that every choice any character made up until the show was predetermined by the timeline. See the problem yet? There's no denying that establishing this takes away from the meaning and purpose of characters' actions and decisions. Steve's sacrifice in the first Avenger for one example, and for an even greater one, everything the Avengers did to undo Thanos' snap in Endgame and defeat him once again. Hell, Tony's sacrifice was predetermined. On what grounds can we even say these choices and decisions were the character's own? It's clearly established in Loki that people in the timeline cannot diverge from their pre-planned paths without becoming variants and causing a Nexus event. That is a pretty significant thing to establish because it means if things had gone differently at any other point of the MCU timeline, it would have triggered a TVA intervention. It also means that everything that did happen was essentially supposed to happen. Not everyone really has to care about this, but it still bothers me a lot as it takes away from the purpose of many important events during the MCU timeline. In my opinion, the TVA should have been repurposed for the sake of primarily staying back and watching the timeline play out, without having a predetermined plan for its end. It would have been so easy for the writers to do that, but oh well, it is what it is. So yeah, Loki isn't really that great in my opinion. There's still a fair bit of stuff I like a lot about the show, such as the interactions between Loki and Mobius, the concept itself, the TVA's scenery and aesthetic, the visuals and effects, the god tier soundtrack, like seriously, it's awesome. And episodes 4 and 5 specifically, which were the high points of the show if you ask me. Overall, I wouldn't call Loki terrible, but the fact is I was expecting way more from it. So I'm sorry to say that I consider it a pretty big letdown given all the issues I presented. Unfortunately, the Marvel Disney Plus show I was most excited for has fallen to become the one I like the least. I hope Season 2 can improve on the show's faults, but I'm not particularly confident in the idea that it will. We'll just have to wait and see what comes next. So that's about all there is to say. You are of course free to disagree and criticize my arguments as always, so if you think I did something wrong, please post it in the comments. With that out of the way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.